I grew up in Ohio, and I went to college for a couple of years in Worcester, in the Amish country. And we had a chapel, and we would bring speakers in. And one time we had D.T. Suzuki, the Zen guy, the great master, and he came in, and he was talking. And I think this is a famous Suzuki story. But he was talking and talking, and we weren't that far from the Cleveland airport. Big jet rolls right over the chapel, and there's about 60 seconds where Suzuki's talk is completely suppressed, and afterwards, one of the I think comparative studies majors at the college said, "Master, why didn't you stop when the jet was going over? Because we lost all that. It might have been very valuable." And the master says, but that was part of the lecture. So any of these accidents are good. I am here, and I was telling Nora that 25 years ago, my wife and I checked out the next house over and against the parking lot. So might have been neighbors, except we couldn't afford it. But I came here in 1969 on Halloween. From California. I was a hippie, and my family in California was disgusted with me, and I got on a plane and left here. And there were two reasons that I converged in Minnesota. One was that I had a girlfriend whose name was Debbie, and her father was an art history teacher at Hamlin University, and they lived on Hewitt Avenue up by Hamlin. And the other was that one of my hippie friends, my friend Worth, lived in Dinkytown, and he made candles and sold them on an Indian bed sheet next to Johnston Hall, next to Northrop. And so I arrived here, and almost immediately I was caught up in some kind of academic thing. Between the art history and the scented candles. But I just liked it here. When I was a kid, I had a grandfather who lived in La Crosse, and he would take me up to, I think it's called Granddad's Bluff. It's kind of a rocky outcropping overlooking La Crosse, the string of islands crossing over to La Crescent, Minnesota. And he pointed across the river and said, "That's Minnesota." Wow, that looks great. And I always had this kind of romantic idea about Minnesota, which I think is deserved. It's a great place. My friend Barry Castleman, who edited Many Corners on the West Bank, I don't know if he made this up or if he came upon it in one of his arcane writings, but he declared that Minneapolis was the biomagnetic center of America. I don't know what that means, but it makes us feel special, and we saw that it was reflected in the proliferation of theaters and poetry readings and art galleries, and there's just a lot of art, a lot of young people, a lot pushing the limits, and I like that almost immediately. And I would say that within my first year of being here, that would be 1970, my girlfriend and I broke up on the last day of the 60s, which I thought was very ominous, December 31st, 1969. And so I was pushed out into the single world, and being lonely and depressed, I started writing poetry. And I would go around to readings, and there were readings all over Dinkytown and the West Bank, and over toward Kenwood, where the Walker and the Guthrie then were. There was a Unitarian society on Mount Curve behind the Guthrie, and I went to like open mic poetry readings, maybe 8 or 9 people sitting around a table, and there was a lot of luminaries there. I was just a young kid, and it was exciting to sit next to a young Garrison Keillor. I didn't know that he was going to go on to what he went on to. Robert Bly was there. Thomas McGrath sometimes sat in. Phoebe Hansen was there, Janae Andrews. All these people were stars to me, and I learned how to write by hanging around with them and listening to them read. I gave my first reading in '72 at the Cafe Extempore on the West Bank, and if it's not apparent from the way I'm talking, I was a very self-absorbed young guy, and I really wanted my poetry to be, wonderful and great and respected, and for people to say, "Oh, you're different from the rest of us." And I went in there, and there was like 9 people in the room, and that was a bad sign. But the worst sign was that the other 8 all had little sheets of paper in their laps. So an open mic reading is just you reading to the other people who are going to read. How can you impress people who are doing that? They weren't listeners, they were participants. And I had poems that I thought were just spectacular, like W.S. Merwin or Robert Bly and like that. And I started reading them, and I realized my hands were shaking and my papers were rattling. And I thought, oh no, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. I'm frightened. And so I kept going to readings. I kept volunteering, and I kept learning a little something every time out. There were so many opportunities. Marley Rusoff had poetry readings in the Savran Rusoff bookstore on, I think, 4th Street in Dinkytown, and it was in that store. In fact, there was a kind of a walk-up area toward the back of the store where the women poets of the Twin Cities met, and we were right on the cusp of what I would call modern feminism. There was feminism before, but it was just catching hold in a big way, and a lot of us were just catching up to it. And I used to go to the women poets of the Twin Cities meetings in order to meet women. That's how I met Mary Ellen, Peter's wonderful wife and the mother of 2 good sons. And it was great. The poetry readings and the art scene supplied all the nutrition I could ask for. I could go to the what's it called? Instaprints, the Instaprint store. Right at that time, there was a new technology called paper plate printing, and you didn't have to, smear paint all over a drum and run it through, which was kind of expensive. It was really very close to what we call photocopying today. And for, $19, $20, you could print off a chapbook, and you could pick it up that day, and there's a staple machine in the back of the room, and you could make your books. So I got into that, and I was printing up books and handing them out to one of my friends. I had to be the most obnoxious self-promoter around. But that was, for me, a good thing, because I learned a lot. Some of the heavy hitters came to town, like Bly and McGrath, and Richard Wilbur came from wherever he was, Harvard or someplace out east. And I met him, and I'd always kind of worshipped him. And he just couldn't have been a nicer man. I met him at the English department at the university. And so many people came through. And Mark Strand was one of them. There was, I think, we talked about there being kind of a, I won't say a villain, but a challenging figure at that time. And he had sort of a monopoly on 2 or 3 of the reading series at the Guild of Performing Arts and the Cafe Extemp and the New Riverside Cafe. And he was kind of a bully. And I was just 20, and I started kind of a nasty little feud, which I hoped would last about 2 weeks, but it ended up lasting about 45 years. Oh. Terrible things happened because this guy didn't like me, but I was very bad to him. I wrote a double truck story in the Minnesota Daily, which I wrote for, and it was a kind of a Tom Wolfe put-on of a poetry reading in the journalism building. And And Mark Strand was the main reader. And I, you know, President Trump talks about fake news, but what I did was pretty darn close to fake news, because I listened in and I eavesdropped and then I made, you know, vast sweeping negative judgments about this person that I'm not naming, and that ran the paper. And I thought, this is delicious. I mean, I was 20 years old. I'd been a war protester, and I was kind of an Abby Hoffman kind of guy, you know, just completely obnoxious. And it blew up in my face, because I thought that I was David against Goliath, but people perceived us as somehow a couple of equal warriors, and there was an equivalency of badness. And so people started to avoid me, and I got shunned. I thought I was setting people free, you know, start your own poetry reading. But instead, people thought I was not a good person, and people that I trusted, like John Sisson and Gregory Bitts and Janae Andrews, they didn't talk to me anymore. So that hurt me. And I became Blythe's, one of his many little altar boys. He had lots of young poets around the state that jingled chimes and mixed the water and wine for him. And I was one of them for the better part of a year and a half. And he liked the attention. I think he liked teaching and, you know, being a leader. But he also had a habit of ridiculing me. He called me Irish. I don't understand that at all. And at one point, he kind of pushed me gently up against the wall, and he says, "Stop publishing. Go away. Figure out who you are. Don't be in such a hurry. Take your foot off the gas." He didn't say all these cliches, but that was his message to me. And, you know, like a lot of people in my generation, the hippies, we were to some degree running away from our parents. And of course we were finding other mothers and finding other fathers, and I have to admit there was a presumptuous part of me that wanted to have, you know, some great man like Robert Bly be my father. And he said that, and it both hurt me and I did it. I did what he said. I stopped trying to publish. Up to that point, I was much too published. He was absolutely right. I was putting out a lot of junk, and it was easy to get published because of those paper plates that I talked about. Publishing was cheap, easy to get published. And so about that time, I just shut up. And I kept writing, but I didn't really share. And it took me 35 years to come back again. And Peter, you've been a witness to this. In the last 7-8 years, I've started to perform again, and I think I came back better, more tied into the audience, and less just about me thumping my chest. But the West Bank and Dinkytown, you know, there was a lot of politics in the air. Jackson State and Kent State happened in 1 week. I was from near Kent State in Ravenna, Ohio. And so I had a beret, kind of a Che Guevara beret, and I lived behind Porky's on University Avenue in St. Paul. And I was pedaling up the hill to the university, and it was the day they had just spread gravel on the tar. That's how they renewed some thoroughfares in those days. And I'm not sure what the story is, but a pickup truck came by. They knew there was a protest maybe going on at the university, and they knocked me down on the bike, and they dragged me about 60 or 70 feet. And instead of getting to the protest, blood going down my arm, and like hundreds of little tiny pieces of gravel embedded in me. My skin is still kind of weird. And I don't know how I got to the University Student Center, but they're picking all this stuff out of me. And they used you interrupt this program to turn my phone down. Sorry, Richard Broderick. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to hang up and turn my sound down. I apologize for that. He didn't know, it's not his fault. And so I showed up for the protest the next day, but I was heavily bandaged, and we managed to get gassed on the mall in front of Kaufman Union. That was the 1970 student riots. Jesus. And I thought that was a very honorable student strike. You know, we quit classes and we were willing to take incompletes on all our courses, and we had a list of demands to make of the administration. The administration was pretty nice about it. At one point we had pickets, and we piled up a bunch of picnic tables on the mall, and I thought that was pretty good. But it's very funny how just 2 years later another student strike took place, and it struck me as kind of uncouth. And you know, I was just 2 years older. How could this happen? And the reason was that the school the Honors College had hired me to edit a literary magazine, and I had an office, and I had access to the office, but the students were clustered around the doors at Johnston Hall, and I thought, this is unfathomable. Why wouldn't you let me into my office? How could my poetry magazine possibly be supporting the war effort? I often think of that. But it was a great time to be young in many ways. What else can we talk about? Nor?
I was just reminded when you told the Bly story that when I went up to speak at the men's conference, after entertaining everybody for a while, he took me aside. Actually, he did it in front of everybody. He told me not ever to read a lecture again, because I was reading my text, you know. And but then he told me not to write again until I could tell stories like Marie-Louise von Franz.
Maybe he was just limited in competition.
I don't know, Mike, but I did not, I didn't wait 35 years, but I did remember what he said, and I think there's some seeds of truth in it. So
yeah, I think there's both wisdom to it, and I think there's an element of meanness and an element of self-servingness, and it was a complicated person. Yeah. He's still living. You know, he's not well anymore. I saw him not too recently. I understand that he's sorry. You know, he knew that he was kind of an overbearing, self-involved guy when he, especially like in his 40s, when he was at his peak of political influence and poetic influence. And I do appreciate him. I wrote a book called Odd Fathers, which is about how I, in my life, picked certain writers that I knew, and I just studied them and wanted to be like them. The poet James Wright, who also spent some time here at the university, he's not my uncle exactly, but he was my stepfather's stepmother's sister's English student and ward of the court in Martins Ferry, Ohio. And I got to travel down and visit with him. And he spent 2 days with me. I was just so lucky, you know. So no hard feelings to those people. Franklin Brainard was another guy. He was a teacher, I think, in Mounds View, and he wasn't known as a poet, but then he got leukemia. And suddenly the leukemia was like a door in for him. And his writing became so much deeper, you know, knowing that death was not far away, he was able to talk about it. He wrote a famous poem called Rain Gatherer. And it was about just begging for life, begging to be known, Begging Not to Die. He was very influential. There was a book press founded by Bly called Minnesota Writers Publishing House that ran here out of town, and it was based on the Swedish Writers Publishing House. And the first 10 poets really kind of put our state on the map in a very kind of co-op-y way. It had a real club feeling, not clubby, but like we were all sharing the load and working on it together. And that was a big break for me. My book was called Home Trees. I never lived specifically in Dinkytown. I lived in South Minneapolis. I had a place on the West Bank for a time. As I said, I was in the Midway in St. Paul. I was in Stadium Village. I made a trip recently of all the places that I lived in as a young man, and they were all demolished. It's because I wasn't rich, so I would rent from places that were already in need of demolition back in the 70s, but by the 2000s, they were actually being demolished. And so it was like visiting parking lot after parking lot after fast food place and thinking, they say that life is short, but life goes on longer than buildings go on. For a time, I was one of the editors of Many Corners on the West Bank. It was a community newspaper. It was set up by Heller Siegel, who were the big landlords, new town, in-town people on the West Bank. And they were very politically controversial because they did a certain amount of cleansing of the neighborhoods. And they hoped to bring in what I would call white, educated, middle-class people to populate those high-rises. And as we know, that plan didn't work. And very interestingly now, the West Bank, which had been a hippie haven, it still has elements of that, but today it's just as much a haven for immigrants from East Africa, which I think is really interesting and really great. My friend, his payment for putting out the newspaper was a free apartment for 22 years. He had no bathroom for 22 years. He used instead a sink, and he made do with that, which is sort of a hippie thing to do. There were so many artists, sculptors and painters and all kinds of artists that flocked to the West Bank. And lots of bars too. They're still mostly there. I remember, what was it called? Mama Rosa's, the restaurant behind the bank. That was a political hotbed. It's called something different now, but it was kind of a pizza and Italian food place. But it was also a hotbed of a weight person organization, and I had a friend that was involved in that. The People Center on the West Bank, they started the first co-op in the basement. They were doing health care, primary care on the first floor, and downstairs there was the first signs of a food co-op. And it was just so primitive. There were barrels of flour and millet and oats and things like that. And people, I went there thinking, I wonder how you do this. I don't know how to do this. And they said, did you bring bags? I said, no, I didn't bring any bags. So I had to come back another time with bags. And whereas all the really cool people, they do exactly, bring your own bags. And don't get that millet. Get the white millet. And so I started baking bread, and this was a time when I was kind of lonely and depressed, and I thought, baking bread, just to knead it and pull it and let it rise, is such a natural event. It kind of recentered me. So every day I'd get up and I'd make kind of a cracked wheat bread using this whole grain flour from the basement of the People Center. And it went great for about 25, 26 days. And on the 27th day, the bread wouldn't rise. Something about the yeast, maybe I'd left it out on the radiator or something. But there was no air pockets in it. It was just a brick. And I just broke down. It was just too much. I was so alone, trying to make things work, and the bread wasn't rising. It started to snow outside. It was the first snowfall of the winter. And I went on the porch and I took this terrible loaf of bread and started swinging it around like a shot put. And I threw it up, kind of like a gaucho's bola, you know, end over end. Laid it on the roof of the garage. All winter, the birds pecked on that loaf of bread. I survived. I got better. There was something called sensitivity training in those days. I don't know if they still do that.
Oh, yeah.
But I think maybe near a college campus especially, you know, if you're a student and you're feeling low about whatever, rejection or bad grades or hard work, you would attend these things and people would start talking to each other. And for many people, it was the first time they'd had adult conversations. Like, you know, sometimes I get mad, or sometimes I feel really insecure around other people, or why don't you just leave me alone? You know, people would give voice to really what was going on inside them, and I joined one of these because I wasn't feeling very good about myself. And it was through the YMCA in Dinkytown on University Avenue, I think. And I went to these meetings and I found it very interesting, and I thought, well, I can do this. And something kind of corrupting happened to me. It was a good thing for me to learn how to express myself, but I also found myself studying the ways of psycho talk. And, you know, there are a few kind of easy tricks you pick up, like, what I hear you saying is, that was my favorite. What I hear you saying is, and then you say something back to that person. It may not have been at all what they were saying, but there was some leverage in being able to say it. And after a while, they named me one of their team leads, and I was having these things at my house, and it's embarrassing to talk about. One night, I all of a sudden had this terrible feeling. We're all sitting on, you know, cross-legged on the floor, roaring fire, maybe a tear here and there. And all of a sudden I got just sick of it. And I stood up and I put my hands on my hips and I laughed. And I walked out of the room and walked out into the street and walked down the sidewalk. And it wasn't until then that I remembered that it was my house. And I had made this gesture on my own house. But it was in the early days of, I guess I would call it New Age wisdom and new insights into psychology. And I'm not saying it was a bad thing, but it got to be, in my case, something that wasn't helping anymore. And I don't think I was helping. What else can I talk about from those times?
So is that the kind of thing you're writing about in your book?
Well, my book, I've tried to write this book several times. It's about being young in the very years that I'm talking about, 1969, 1970. I spent some time in Los Angeles, I spent some time at a commune in Colorado, and then I came here and lived in some communal situations. And some of them were positive. We learned basic skills. After about 2 or 3 communes, you learn you have to do the dishes. We put up with incredible things. You know, we didn't have skills because we were so young. This woman brought a cat into one of the communes, and the cat had diarrhea, and the other people in the family, we said, maybe you could put that cat in the closet. We didn't have any concrete suggestion for what to do with the sick cat. But no, she says no, she wouldn't like that at all. So the cat had free reign, walked all the way through the house. It was a terrible place to live. And we didn't have the authority, we didn't have the leadership skills, we didn't have the brain, I would say, to say, come on, there's got to be a solution. Imodium AD may not be on the market yet, but there's got to be something. There's got to be something we could do for that pussycat. A lot of funny stories, some sad ones. At one point, it is my belief that I met Charles Manson. This was in California, and it was in the Mojave Desert. And I was running one of these universal life churches where you send in a postcard and they give you a Doctor of Divinity degree. And it's supposed to help you with a draft, and it's supposed to help you maybe with property taxes, and we were trying to use it to enforce a sanctuary law, so that people couldn't come into our church and arrest us for, getting high, and we never put that to the test. I have a feeling the LAPD weren't the pushovers that we imagined they might be. But we went out to our fellow church out in the Mojave, and it was a chaotic place. There were different small groups of bikers arriving all day and drinking wine, and they didn't like each other, and they would fight. And at the end of the day, the Hells Angels showed up, and they were famous even then. And they picked a fight with this other group, the Sons of Troy, and they beat them. I retreated with this other school bus up away from the house, and the bikers are fighting, and this guy, he's driving a black school bus. There's about 8 girls on the bus, and there's one other guy besides him. And this guy, very intense, long-haired, brown eyes, comes over and says, "Hey man, you got any water I can use to make tea?" I said, "Sure, we got a big bag of water." I gave him some water, and he took it back and made tea. And it wasn't till like a year and a half later that I saw that was the guy that we associated with those famous murders. This was before the murders. So, see the stars. But it was a time when so many young people in the country were just going around, hitchhiking around. I had to change my residency to come to Minnesota. And the Board of Regents had a pretty stiff rule saying that if you couldn't prove that you were a resident of Minnesota, you couldn't have in-state tuition. So I was thinking, how can I show that I have an intention to remain in Minnesota? And then I came up with the idea of making a down payment on a gravesite. And it was a place over by the Capitol in St. Paul, and it cost me $40. It was sort of a lot of money. But I took it to Morrill Hall and showed him, see, this is my statement of my intention to remain permanently in Minnesota. He laughed and laughed, and they gave it to me. I was working at M&L Motor Supply on University Avenue when I first got here, and I was an order filler. But I was also taking classes at the university, and one of my classes was in prosody, rhymes and rhythms and things in poetry, figures of speech. Very interesting class. I enjoyed it very much. But it was hard balancing work life and school life. And one day, I was putting a tailpipe up on a shelf, and the thing started to slide down, and I'm on like a 6-foot ladder. This tailpipe comes down, and you can see where it hit me. It's this bump on my head, and it knocked me backwards on the ladder, and I fell on the wood floor. And I woke up, and I'm bleeding, and I got this goose egg coming out of my skull. And I remembered, I've got a class at the university. I've got a test. Today's my exam on prosody. And I'm kind of crazy. Everything is moving. I run out onto University Avenue, grab the 16A bus, and I say, "You've got to get me to the university." And the guy says, "It's 85 cents. And I didn't have it. I said, "Just get me there." And I go back and I sit down. I was kind of psycho. And I didn't have a coat. It was winter. I was in a green t-shirt, and I get to Ford Hall, which is where the humanities classes were held. And I go up there, and everybody's working on their blue books, everybody's putting in their answers, and they look up at me, and I look like Lon Chaney. I look crazy. And I grab a blue book, and I open it, and then something really weird happened. It was about analyze this poem, and it was a poem by A.E. Housman, who wrote A Shropshire Lad, very British, very pre-World War I. And it was about a man climbing the gallows steps to be hanged. It's only like 3 stanzas long. And I knew this poem for some reason. I couldn't figure it out, but I knew everything about it. And I sat down and I dashed off an answer in the blue book. Couldn't have written more than 8, 9 sentences. And I got up and I threw it down on the desk of the proctor who was watching the students and walked out, and I felt like a hero. I got an A. But when I came out, I thought, this is my town. I'm going to make this place work for me.
I wanted to follow up on this ministerial stuff, because I think
Ministerial?
Yeah, because it walks right the line between being a sort of joke and something that's has been really serious for
Well,
you.
I can tell you something about it. It was started by a Baptist preacher named Kirby J. Hensley in around 1964. He was in South Carolina, and he was just fed up with what he perceived to be the ways of the Southern Baptist Church. So he said, I'm going to start a church which will mock the existing churches, and I'll let just anybody that wants to be a minister. And he moved to Modesto, California, up in the Emerald Valley. And at that time, there were political magazines like Ramparts and The Realist and things like that, and he became famous through them. And I think I was one of hundreds of thousands of college students who sent off for this postcard priesthood. Now, when we got where we were going and started the commune, we decided to hitchhike up to Modesto, California. I'm not quite sure what we had in mind, but I think we were going to pay tribute. It's like a papal audience, you know. But we didn't tell Kirby J. Hensley. We just showed up on his doorstep, you know, after dark. And evidently, tens of thousands of young men, exactly like me, were doing the same thing. And we knocked on the door, and he said, "You can't sleep here." It's kind of like the man at the gate in The Wizard of Oz. The wizard says go away. But he did say there is a county park down the road, about a half mile. They'll let you. They won't bother you if you curl up against a tree there. Did it work against anything? I don't know. I got drafted. I missed my induction. I missed my draft physical. I had like 3 separate legal initiatives to try to stay out of the war. I didn't think I was a conscientious objector. In those days, they had a test, which is the recruitment officer would say, you come into your home, and there's your mother, and she's being raped by Ho Chi Minh. What are you going to do then, huh? And the guy would fold his arms. And he'd think he had you. And what can you say? You can't peel him apart gently. You can't politely request that Ho Chi Minh stop raping your mother. And another catch was that there's a line in the application form which asked, do you advocate the overthrow of the United States by force or violence? And the joke among us hippies was, violence. Like it was a choice, a multiple choice. God, conscientious objector humor. I still got drafted. I was in the Army for about 9-10 days. My folks intervened and got the jurisdiction changed so that there was a civil case against me instead of a court-martial. I got into college again. I went to Pepperdine University, which was called Pat Boone university because he was on the board of regents. And they kicked him out about 6 months later because he was too liberal.
Ugh.
But it kept me out of the war. I don't think I would have made a very valuable contribution. Sometimes I go down to the cemetery down at Snelling, and I realize that not all those graves are of, combat soldiers by a long shot. I mean, family members and everybody that is attached to a military family has the right to be buried there if they want to. But still, I think of all the boys from my high school class and my college classes that didn't have a family lawyer, and maybe didn't have the leverage to stay out of that. It was a terrible thing. That war really drove, to a very large extent, a lot of the new age things that were happening, because we just wanted to find a better way to live in the world than invading other countries. Anything else? I could pause for a second. I feel kind of talked out. I don't know.
We're fine. One thing I remember from about the time I first met you is that you were publishing your friends.
Barry Castleman?
Yeah, Barry. I don't know if there were others. But there
Mary
were,
Ellen and I did a book
yeah, I
together.
remember that. That would seem to me just the sort of thing that was happening all over the place, that all sorts of things that people normally go through hoops for and prepare for and make a big fuss about were kind of happening. You want to head a movement? Well, somebody's this overslept. You can head the movement today, or you want to be published? Well, let's go down to Kinko's and see if we can get that done. We probably have your books in the store by this afternoon if we're lucky. But that was the pattern. This is a story I'm hearing over and over.
Yeah, it was really the mentality of the Whole Earth catalog. Stuart Brand. This catalog was 300 broadside pages of ideas about how to run the world differently, starting with very little things like cider presses. But the idea that I could provide third-party endorsement for Mary Ellen or Barry Castleman or any of my friends, just like Poetry Magazine does for John Ciardi or some of those famous people, was kind of a revolutionary notion. And the letters on the page are letters on the page. B. Dalton still didn't want our books because they didn't want to deal with the distribution hassles of dealing with somebody with a closet full of books. But you're right, it was a new way. And I think what I was hoping for was that some of the things from the olden times, like there being superstar writers and stuff, I thought that would continue. And maybe if I was lucky and I kept my nose clean, I wrote a lot, and I was good, that I might be one of those. But I really, truly believe that time ended at the same time. That in a way we don't live in a world of that kind of stars anymore. I know we have celebrities in Hollywood and stuff, but Robert Bly was an important American writer. I don't see anybody that's anywhere near inherited that kind of mantle since Bly's time. We're all just civilians.
When you went through that time of depression when you were living over in West Bank, I think,
Yeah.
and started writing poetry, I mean, you said that sort of lightly, but why did you start writing poetry? Or had you been interested in it already?
I had been writing. I'd been writing a lot. In the second grade, I was writing little talking animal stories and things. So writing was not a new thing to me. But I think, I'd be writing, like Hallmark type verse as a young boy. But when my heart was broken, I started writing about my broken heart and how to get it unbroken. And it became kind of like those Pegs group, those counseling for peers. It
Yeah,
was like that.
co-counseling, yeah.
You'd go to your problems. I mean, the problem was it still wasn't very honest very often. It was often melodramatic or, self-absorbed or, but it was trying. It was trying to get at what was happening in your life and have something to say about it, maybe acquire some power over it. But I found it to be fun.
Yeah.
I said it lightly, and it at its very best for me, it is light. It provides light. It's fun to do. I don't think it's a sacred pastime. I really like to think of it as a cool hobby. Like videography or flag tying. That it provides meaning. It takes you into yourself. It's kind of a low-grade meditation. And then you can share it, maybe. But it's really been, I've had, in many ways, a life marked with tragedies. I've lost a child. I'm terminally ill. My share of sad events, but I still enjoy writing, and I like to think of it as a present that I'm wrapping up for that handful of people that are willing to listen to me, and I love them for it.
When Peter asked the question about the ministerial connection, I didn't know what was behind that, but I'm interested in your mentioning what it is that you have to bear, and I've been thinking a lot about it myself as part of the aging process, how much sorrow there is as we get older and aware of our children's lives and grandchildren's lives in my case, but wonder whether poetry has been continued to be a way of bearing that, or if there's something more behind the question about the spiritual life.
I'm kind of a Pollyanna on this issue. I was on our website this morning. It's called Lawless. My friend John Winstrom runs it. And we've got people coming from all over the world, maybe 50, 75 people, and they'll drop their poems every day. They're writing a lot. And I'm struck by how miserable they are. I'm struck by how so many people think it's up to them to describe the world and make everything work and be philosophical and have all this big stuff, and I might write about my feet, which Neruda did. So there's a tradition for that. But I want to say, lighten up, folks. You don't have to be miserable, or you don't have to make yourself more miserable by dramatizing your misery on a piece of paper. I for one, am not a big believer in poetry as therapy. I know that people benefit by communicating on paper, but when people get to feeling like, oh, I'm a poet now, I've got a beret, treat me differently, I'm of a different order, I think they've gone into a bad place.
I got a glimpse, kind of, just at the, at the Minnesota Literature newsletter folding parties, which I think was where I met you.
Yeah. All those wounds we have on our fingertips.
Yeah, all those paper cuts from all those years. Well, I got a glimpse of, the poets and writers and sometimes publishers hanging out together. And I didn't ever know much about that, that as a community, or what kinds of intertwinings there were in those lives, except a few stories I got from Mary Ellen. But was it a helpful community? Were the interactions between those people over those years growth promoting, do you think? I mean, you had some bad experience.
No, I think a lot of people really inspired me. I was at Phoebe Hanson's first reading at the Theater in the Round on the West Bank. She was like 40, 41, and she just started writing at that time in her life. She was from Sacred Heart, Minnesota. And there wasn't there's not many metaphors in her work. She just tells you what happened to her. And it's a very bare naked kind of writing. And she stood up there and she was brave and she talked to people. And I thought, that's the way you do it. She wasn't trying to sound the clarion call of any kind. She was just really telling you her stories. And they were funny. They were pithy. I adored Phoebe. And there were some people like that. And that's the kind of person that I would have liked. I liked people that were trying to tell the truth about their lives, but not, I guess, manipulate the way you think about their lives. Poetry isn't very fair, you know. No one ever gets to rebut you, you know. You tell what your view is, and they got to stick with it. They got to accept it. Well, that's what he's saying. I have tried in little ways to find a more bidirectional flow of feelings and thoughts with people. I like to entertain. I did some thespian stuff when I was young, and I like to act and sell the poem.
Have you done playwriting?
You know, I don't think I have.
Oh.
I think I tried to. In fact, I tried writing something for Theater in the Round. They had a contest or something. But no. I think I got stuck on poetry and journalism early, and I haven't really moved too far away from that.
Mm-hmm.
I was a TV writer. I've done a lot of commercial work, and I think that's a good thing. I often tell writers, I said, you know, I can see you're trying to be a poet, but you don't know how to write a sentence. And, you know, that's a really valuable part of the toolkit is knowing how a sentence is. You know, something doing something, something being done, something being done to. And I really feel that in many ways that the good writers are not flowing into poetry. They're, I don't know, maybe writing fiction or writing journalism or writing leaflets for some company, because a lot of these things just don't make much sense. The beat movement was good in many ways, but it also ushered in a lot of fractured stuff.
When I think about the people who've occupied that chair before you, there's a story. It starts out the way you do, and it's kind of it's a story of people falling into unexpected opportunities of all sorts, and unexpected leadership roles, and unexpected connections. I guess we've heard that, 10 or a dozen times. I never thought. I just went to the meeting and it surprised me that I ended up chair of the committee, and then that I went to Washington, and then, I gave a little talk and somebody came up and said, why don't you go to graduate school? We'll pay you. These are the stories you hear. Opportunity was like on every tree. And I think you've had a lot of some of that.
I've been lucky. I was 27 years old. I'm working in the sub-basement of Morrill Hall, the university's administration building. And I'm a perfectly happy individual. I'm putting out this little newspaper. It's really easy to do. I'm working with women that all treat me like a prince. It's just so great. The phone rings. I pick it up, and it's Paul Gruco, who was a naturalist and a journalist and many different things. A brilliant man. And he says, hey, Mike, how'd you like to come out to Worthington and run the paper for me? And for some reason or other, he'd come upon a story I wrote about the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And for him, it was the greatest thing ever. And he extrapolated from that one story that I was the perfect man to come out to Worthington and beat that newspaper into shape. I went out there thinking I wouldn't want to do it. but I just kind of was captivated by the town and the idea of talking to a whole town every single day, every afternoon they get the paper, and I'd be in charge of everything: headlines, captions, editing the writers, pictures, what page it goes on, placement. And I thought, this is a mind-blowing opportunity. And they didn't give me a cent more than I was making at the university. And it meant ripping my roots and leaving Dinkytown, Stadium Village in the West Bank. But I got in my car, drove out there. I sang all the way back. It was so happy. I thought, I'm the luckiest man in the world. Just, it was stupid that he called me. It was a character failure on his part. He decided, kind of like the guy in the Cane Mutiny, or, you know, and in fact, Paul did have problems. But doggone it, he brought me out there. I lived in the country, did a good job. It made me so, so happy. And it made me feel that I could do about anything. I think I've been kind of gutsy with my life because of Paul Gruco. And so I'll always be grateful to him for that.
How long did you do that?
Just a couple years. That's the other good
Fantastic.
thing. Because they had a habit of bringing out like daily editors, and then they would like languish. You know, there would be moss growing over them. They'd be there 6-7 years. They couldn't sell their house. But my wife, Rachel, got accepted at Yale University. And I thought, get out of here. No one in my family is going to go to Yale University. But she got accepted at the nursing school, the master's program. And took me east. Here I'm a bi-coastal gentleman. That was also very good luck. It was good luck to go there and really good luck to get out of there.
Yeah.
You don't want to get stuck in heaven.
So I remember one of your book titles is Lucky You.
Yeah.
So,
That was that depressing book that I was talking about. It was my first book. Here's a cool story about the West Bank. I wanted to meet other poets. I was 21 years old. I type up index cards individually because you can't copy index cards, and I stapled them to telephone poles all up and down Cedar Avenue. And it said, Poetry Study Group, want to join? I think it was W-A-N-N-A, join. Call this number. And nobody called. About, I'd say, 4 months later, I get a phone call. I said, hello, Mike. This is Charles Potts. I just was leaning against the telephone pole, and I saw your index card. Charles Potts is a regional hero in the Rocky Mountain area.
Oh.
He's this magnificent, psychedelic, politic, barnstorming poet. So he's very energetic, and he doesn't hold back, and he's not trying to please you. He's just telling the truth. I was nothing like him. But he came to my house. I put him up and his friend, and I showed him some of my little trembling poems. And he says, "This is a good start, Mike." So those cards on the telephone pole. I mean, you never know. You never know.
yeah.
West Bank was a magical place.
Just thinking of, the life of a poet, one thing I got to witness, I think it may have been at the moment it was happening, the funniest thing happening anywhere in any universe. And the angels were all gathered, charging admission, and it was, Tom McGrath visiting his farmer relatives who lived a quarter of a mile down the road, and sort of, what do you do when, the poet comes home?
It wouldn't have been a problem with Tom at all. He showed up at a party at my house once, like an hour early. He just screwed up. And he just sat down in a chair and just talked very gently and amiably for an hour. He didn't keep us from setting the table or vacuuming the floor. He was, there's such a thing as showing up early for a party and being the perfect guest. He just wasn't demanding,